Title: Endless Night and the Awakening of the Hero. The world was shrouded in an eternal twilight, a never-ending night that refused to give way to the sun. The stars above were cold and distant, their light weak and flickering as if even the heavens themselves had grown weary. In the heart of this endless night, there lay a kingdom forgotten by time. Once a place of prosperity and warmth, it now stood silent, its streets empty, its castles decaying. In the deepest chamber of the royal palace, a figure lay still upon an ancient altar. A hero, long lost to history, whose name had once been sung by the people in the days before the darkness began. The hero's name was Kale, and he had been the protector of the kingdom. He had fought against the encroaching night with unwavering resolve, but one fateful battle had left him defeated and on the verge of death. He had been sealed away in the hopes that one day, a time would come when the light would return and the hero would rise again. But that time had not yet come. As the hours stretched into days, the kingdom remained locked in its unyielding night. The people were no longer seen or heard, as if swallowed by the shadows themselves. Yet in the silence, a faint pulse began to stir within the palace. A soft breath, barely perceptible, escaped from Kale's lips. His chest rose and fell, a sign that life still clung to him. A sudden warmth filled the air, spreading like a gentle breeze through the darkened halls of the palace. The pulse grew stronger, the light that had been absent for so long beginning to stir once more. Kale's hand twitched, and then, with a slow but determined movement, he opened his eyes. The world before him was foreign on endless night stretched out into the distance, and the world felt wrong. The sky was a swirling abyss of black and purple, a canvas untouched by the dawn. Kale sat up, feeling the weight of years, no, centuries pressing down on his weary body. His sword, once gleaming with the light of 1,000 battles, now lay dormant at his side, its edge dulled by the passage of time. Yet, in his heart, there was a fire that refused to be extinguished. He rose from the altar, his mind clouded with memories of the past. The last battle, the final struggle against the forces of darkness, had ended in defeat. But now, he was awake. Why have I returned? Kale whispered to the empty halls. His voice was hoarse, as if it had not been used in an age. The answer came not in words, but in the form of a vision. A shimmering light appeared before him, taking shape in the form of a woman, her figure delicate yet strong. She was draped in a robe of silver, her eyes glowing with an ethereal light. "Kale," she said softly, her voice like a melody, "the kingdom calls to you. The darkness grows stronger, and the people are lost in its grip. You are the last hope." "Who are you?" Kale demanded, though his voice held no anger. There was only confusion and a sense of obligation. "I am Alara, the spirit of the kingdom's light. Long ago, you swore an oath to protect this land, and though the darkness has taken so much, your destiny is not yet fulfilled." Kale looked around him, the silence of the world pressing in on him like a physical force. "I failed once. I couldn't stop the night. How can I face it again?" Alara's eyes softened. "You are not the same as before, Kale. The power of the light sleeps within you still. But you must awaken it. You must journey through the land and reclaim the lost fragments of the ancient light." A surge of power rushed through him as if her words had ignited something deep within his soul. He could feel it, the light, faint but present, calling to him. Kale knew that his path would not be easy. The kingdom had fallen into ruin, and the night had twisted the land into a place of shadows and nightmares. The creatures of darkness now roamed freely, and the once vibrant cities were now ghostly echoes of what they had been. But he also knew that he could not ignore his purpose. The people, wherever they may be, still needed him. He grabbed his sword, now gleaming faintly with a forgotten light, and began his journey. He ventured into the vast wilderness, where the land itself seemed to resist him, but with each step, he could feel the power within him growing. The first trial came quickly. In a ruined temple, Kale faced a creature unlike any he had seen, a shadowy beast that seemed to be made of the very darkness he sought to defeat. Its eyes glowed red with malice, and it lunged at him with terrifying speed. Kale's sword clashed with the beast's shadowy form, but it seemed to dissolve with each strike, only to reform again. "You cannot defeat the darkness with your sword alone," Alara's voice echoed in his mind. "You must reach deep within yourself." With a roar, Kale closed his eyes and focused on the faint light that remained within him. He could feel it now, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He extended his hand, and the light erupted from his body in a brilliant wave, scattering the shadowy beast into nothingness. He had awakened the first fragment of the light. As Kale journeyed onward, he encountered more trials, each one testing him in different ways. Some were battles against creatures of the night, while others were inner struggles facing his fears, regrets, and doubts. But with each victory, the light within him grew stronger, and the world around him began to shift. The darkness began to recede, just a little, and the first rays of dawn touched the horizon. Kale knew that the battle was far from over. The darkness would not yield easily, and the trials ahead would be even greater. But he had regained hope, and with it, the strength to face whatever lay ahead. At last, Kale reached the heart of the kingdom, where the darkness was most potent. Here, in the ruins of the castle, the source of the eternal night lay in ancient crystal, tainted by dark magic. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, feeding the night and preventing the dawn. But Kale was no longer the man who had fallen in defeat. He had faced the darkness and reclaimed the light. With one final surge of power, he thrust his sword into the heart of the crystal, shattering it. The darkness screamed, a sound of fury and defeat, and began to unravel. The night finally began to fade, the first rays of the sun breaking through. As the light returned to the world, Kale stood tall, gazing at the horizon where the sun rose for the first time in centuries. The kingdom was free, and the people wherever they were would soon awaken to a new day. Kale's journey had not been easy, but he had fulfilled his destiny. The hero had risen once more, and the endless night was no more. After Kale's victory over the shadow beast and the first spark of light that began to push the darkness back, he continued his journey into the heart of the kingdom. But the path ahead was not simple. As he ventured deeper into the once thriving lands, he came across a forgotten city, its streets overgrown with vines and its buildings worn down by time. There was a haunting silence here, as though the city had once been alive with laughter and song, but now only memories remained. The faintest sound of wind whistled through the empty streets, carrying with it a sense of abandonment. Kale paused at the entrance of a grand temple that stood at the center of the city. The stone doors, once magnificent, were cracked and covered in moss. Something felt strange, almost as if the city itself was watching him. "Is this where it all began?" Kale murmured. As he stepped inside, a chill swept over him. The temple's grand hall was dark, the air heavy with dust. At the far end, an altar stood, its surface adorned with ancient inscriptions. The light from Kale's sword illuminated the room, casting long shadows against the walls. Suddenly, the ground trembled. A low, rumbling sound echoed from the shadows as figures began to emerge, their forms shrouded in darkness. They were the remnants of those who had once inhabited this place, people twisted by the night, their eyes hollow and their skin pale. They were not fully alive, but not fully dead either. The curse of the darkness had claimed them. One of them stepped forward, a woman, her face both familiar and distant, her eyes filled with sorrow. She spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. "Kale, You have returned. But you are too late, she said. The light is lost. We were the last to resist, but we failed. Kale's heart tightened as he recognized her. She was a guardian, someone who had once fought alongside him. Her name was Elra, and she had been his closest ally. We fought together, Elra, Kale said, his voice breaking. What happened here? The darkness. It took everything. Our people, our land, our hope. We held on as long as we could, but in the end, the night swallowed us whole. And now we are the shadows. Elra's form flickered, her body fading in and out as though she were not entirely bound to this world. I can't undo what's been done, Kale said, his voice filled with regret. But I can still fight. I can still bring the light back. Elra nodded, her expression a mix of sorrow and hope. Then go, Kale. The heart of the darkness lies beyond this city, in the castle that once ruled this land. Only there will you find the source. Destroy it, and the night will fall no more. Kale pressed on, leaving the city behind. The journey took him through the desolate wilderness, where once vibrant forests had withered into twisted, gnarled trees, and rivers ran dry. The world itself seemed to mourn, as if it had given up hope long ago. But Kale was resolute. Each step brought him closer to the castle, the epicenter of the darkness that had engulfed his world. As he approached, the castle loomed in the distance, its spires towering like jagged teeth against the sky, shrouded in the thickest of fogs. The gates of the castle stood wide open, as if inviting him in. But Kale knew better. This was no place of warmth or welcome. This was the domain of the darkness. The air inside the castle was heavy with the scent of decay, the walls covered in creeping shadows that seemed to reach out for him. As Kale moved deeper into the castle, he could feel the presence of something ancient and powerful. It was the heart of the darkness, pulsing with malevolent energy. At the center of the grand hall, a throne stood, empty but waiting. The ground beneath Kale's feet began to tremble once more, and from the shadows, a figure emerged. Cloaked in black, with eyes that gleamed like burning embers, the figure was tall and imposing. Kale, the hero who has returned, the figure said in a voice that was both calm and terrifying. Do you think you can end what was set in motion long ago? The night cannot be undone. The darkness is eternal. Kale's grip on his sword tightened. I refuse to accept that. The light will return. The figure chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Kale's spine. You are brave, but foolish. The light is but a fleeting thing. The darkness, it is forever. With a snap of his fingers, the shadows around the throne twisted and coiled, forming into monstrous shapes that surged toward Kale. He raised his sword, the light within him flaring as he met the darkness head-on. The battle was fierce, the clash of light and shadow filling the air with a deafening roar. Kale fought with everything he had, his body growing weaker with each passing moment. But still, he pressed on, his sword glowing brighter with each strike. Finally, with one final, desperate blow, Kale pierced the heart of the darkness, the source of the endless night. A burst of light erupted from the castle, scattering the shadows and sending the dark figure stumbling back. No, this is not the end. The figure screamed, but it was too late. The light consumed the darkness, unraveling it from the inside out. The castle shook, its foundations cracking and crumbling as the curse that had plagued the land for centuries finally broke. As the darkness faded, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The sky, once a void of black, now shimmered with hues of pink, gold, and violet. Kale stood amidst the ruins of the castle, his sword still glowing with the light he had awakened within himself. He could feel the power of the dawn filling the world around him, pushing back the shadows and restoring life to the land. The winds had changed. carrying with them the promise of a new beginning. Kale gazed toward the horizon, where the sun rose higher, its golden light bathing the kingdom in warmth once more. The people, though scattered and lost, would return. The kingdom would rebuild. The eternal night was over. He had fulfilled his destiny. But Kale knew that his journey was far from finished. The land needed healing, and there would be more battles to fight, more darkness to face. But for now, he could rest. The hero had awoken, and the world was reborn. The sun now rose every day, its light bringing warmth and hope to a world that had known only darkness for so long. The kingdom began to flourish again, the land healing from the scars of the night. Kale, the hero who had once been lost to time, now walked among the people, not as a legend or a memory, but as a living symbol of hope. The light he had awakened within himself had spread throughout the world, and with it, the promise of a brighter future. And as he looked to the skies, Kale knew that while this chapter had ended, the story of the world and his journey was only just beginning. Kale had taken his place among the people, helping them rebuild the kingdom in the aftermath of the endless night. But though the light had returned, the weight of the battles he had fought still lingered within him. Each day, he saw the faces of those who had suffered, those who had lost everything to the darkness. And while the world was healing, Kale could feel that something was still missing. It was on one such evening, as the golden light of sunset bathed the newly reborn village in its warm glow, that Kale felt the stirring of something ancient. A sense that there was more to this victory than simply banishing the darkness. He turned to the horizon, where the land stretched out, wide and full of possibilities. The world was free of the curse, but Kale knew that the balance of light and dark was delicate. His thoughts were interrupted when he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw the familiar forms of Elra and the other guardians, the spirits of those who had fallen long ago, yet who had been freed from the shackles of the night when the darkness was destroyed. Elra, her form glowing with a soft, ethereal light, smiled at him. "Kale," she said, her voice gentle but full of an unspoken depth. "The battle is over, but the war between light and dark is far from finished. We, the Guardians, have returned. You've come back?" Kale's voice was filled with wonder. "But how? The darkness is gone." Elra stepped forward, her face serene. "The balance between light and dark never truly ends, Kale. It shifts, it evolves, but it never disappears. We have watched the world for eons, guarding its peace, protecting it from forces beyond the understanding of mortal beings. The darkness you defeated was but a manifestation of the chaos that lurks beyond the veil. And though the world has been freed for now, there will always be forces that seek to tip the balance." Kale's heart sank as he realized the weight of her words. "Then, my journey isn't over?" "No," Elra said. "There will be peace for a time. The light will flourish, and the people will know joy again. But there are those beings from the shadowed realms that will seek to reclaim what was lost. They will challenge the light, as they have before. You, Kale, are the key. The hero who awoke the dawn. But to keep the balance, you must continue your journey." Kale stood silently, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The weight of Elra's words pressed against him like an unseen force, but there was something else within him to hope. The light he had awakened was strong, but it needed to be nurtured, protected. And he was the one who would see it through. "I will continue," Kale said, his voice resolute. "I've fought for this peace, and I will fight to keep it." Elra nodded. "We will guide you, Kale. The Guardians are always with you." As Kale ventured deeper into the mountains at the edge of the kingdom, the landscape began to change. The air grew thin and cold, the ground rugged and treacherous. A sense of unease grew within him, and he knew that his path was taking him towards something unknown. The guardians had warned him of the forces still lurking in the world, creatures and entities that existed beyond the reach of mortal understanding. These forces, born of darkness, would seek to undo all that Kale had fought to preserve. The battle he had won was only a temporary one. The true challenge lay ahead. One evening, as he camped beneath the towering peaks, Kale heard it, the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. At first, it was nothing more than a fluttering sound, like the rustle of leaves in a distant forest. But then it grew louder, until it became a voice, low and sinister, calling to him. Kale, Kale, the hero of light. You cannot escape your fate. The voice was all around him, filling his mind and heart with a cold chill. His hand instinctively moved to his sword, and his eyes scanned the darkness around him. The shadows seemed to move, as though they were alive, whispering his name. Who's there? Kale demanded, his voice strong. The whispers stopped, and in the stillness that followed, a figure materialized before him. It was a shadow, tall and imposing, its form shifting and changing as though it were not bound by the laws of the physical world. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a deep crimson that seemed to burn with malice. You think the darkness is gone? The figure asked, its voice echoing in Kale's mind. You think the world is free? There are others, Kale. Others who still seek to bring the night. Kale gripped his sword tightly, his heart racing. I won't let you have it. The light is stronger than your darkness. The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rattle the air around them. The light is fleeting. It always is. It's a fire that will burn itself out. Darkness. Darkness is eternal. You cannot defeat it. With that, the figure lunged forward, the shadows surging like a tidal wave. Kale swung his sword, a brilliant flash of light illuminating the darkness, but it was only momentarily. The figure recoiled but quickly returned, the shadows growing stronger. Kale fought with all his might, the light of his sword battling against the crushing weight of the darkness. But the more he fought, the more the shadows seemed to multiply. And in the midst of the chaos, Kale realized the truth: the battle was not just against one shadow, but against the very concept of darkness itself. The battle raged on through the night, with Kale slowly losing ground. The darkness was relentless, and though he fought with every ounce of strength he could feel the shadows creeping into his heart, whispering doubts. Is this what it's all for? He thought. Will the darkness always come back? But as the shadows closed in, something deep within Kale stirred. The light he had awakened, the light of hope and resilience, was still there, still burning. It was not the weapon or the sword that held the power, but the strength of the heart. I am not afraid, Kale whispered to himself. With a mighty cry, Kale thrust his sword into the ground, calling upon the light within him to surge outward. The light flared, blinding and pure, pushing back the shadows with a force unlike anything before. The figure of darkness recoiled, its form twisting in agony. This isn't over, it screeched, its form disintegrating into the night. The darkness will return. It always does. But Kale's resolve did not waver. The light was strong, and though the darkness might return, he would stand ready to face it. He had learned the truth: light and dark were two sides of the same coin. One could not exist without the other, but with balance, the world could thrive. As the darkness dissipated, Kale stood alone on the mountain, his sword glowing brightly in the quiet stillness. The battle was over for now. But his journey had only just begun. The light had returned, and Kale had become a legend. But not just a hero of the past. He was the protector, the eternal guardian of the balance between light and darkness. His journey would continue, for as long as the night could whisper, and the dawn could rise. Kale would walk the path of the hero, guarding the peace he had fought so hard to protect. The world had been saved. And the hero had awakened. Weeks passed since Kale had driven back the darkness in the mountains. Life in the kingdom had flourished, but an undercurrent of unease remained. Though the skies were clear and the land vibrant, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that the peace was fragilely a fleeting moment in the grand dance between light and shadow. One evening, as Kale walked through the restored village, he felt a strange pull, a deep, magnetic force that drew him toward the heart of the kingdom. There, in the open square, a mysterious figure awaited him. The figure was cloaked in shadow, their face obscured by a dark hood, but the glow of their eyes shone through, a soft and unsettling light. Kale's hand instinctively went to his sword as he approached, his senses alert. He had seen such eyes before, the eyes of the dark being he had defeated. But this figure felt different, like a distant echo of a power far greater. "I've been waiting for you, Kale," the figure spoke, their voice smooth like velvet, but carrying an underlying threat. "You are the hero who awoke the dawn, the one who banished the night. But you're not the only one with the power to shape the world." Kale narrowed his eyes, taking a defensive stance. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure stepped forward, and the shadows around them seemed to pulse and writhe. "I am a messenger, a herald of a new dawn. You may have defeated the darkness, Kale, but there are other forces in the world, far older than the one you faced. Forces that govern the very balance of life itself." Kale felt a chill run down his spine. He had defeated the darkness, but this new force seemed even more potent. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising unease. "There is a storm coming," the figure said, their words heavy with forewarning. "A storm that will shake the foundations of your world. The balance you fought so hard to preserve. It's in danger. The forces that you call light and dark are merely two sides of the same coin. But there are other forces that control the flow of time, the very fabric of reality itself. You are merely one player in this cosmic game, Kale." The figure's words hung in the air like an omen. Kale's grip tightened on his sword. "I've faced darkness before. I will face whatever comes." The cloaked figure smiled, a dangerous glint in their eyes. "We shall see. The storm is already here." With those final words, the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving Kale standing alone in the square, the weight of their message settling in his chest like a stone. As the days passed, Kale found himself drawn to the ancient temples at the edges of the kingdom. The message of the cloaked figure haunted Hiva knew that the battle was far from over. And that something much older and more powerful than the darkness awaited him. The temple was old, its stone walls weathered by centuries of time. Inside, Kale found himself surrounded by symbols and carvings that depicted gods long forgotten by mortal men. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the vast chamber. In the center of the temple stood a large, glowing orb, a relic from the time of the ancients. As Kale approached, the orb began to hum, and the room seemed to come alive with energy. From the shadows, a voice spoke. "You have come." Kale turned quickly, drawing his sword, but there was no sign of the speaker. The voice continued, soft but powerful. "You seek answers, Kale. Answers to the storm that is coming." "I do," Kale said, lowering his weapon but remaining on alert. "Who are you?" "We are the gods of old, the keepers of the forces that govern the very existence of the world. We watch as mortals struggle with their petty wars, their fleeting hopes and dreams. But now, the balance has been disturbed. You have awakened the light, but the darkness you defeated was but a shadow of what exists beyond. You, Kale, have set in motion forces you do not fully understand." Kale's heart raced. He had faced so many trials, but now, standing before these ancient beings, he realized just how small he truly was in the grand scheme of the universe. The storm you were warned of, the voice continued, is the first of many challenges. The forces that manipulate time, space, and reality itself will rise, and you must be prepared. Kale clenched his fists. I will fight. I've fought darkness before. I can fight whatever this is. The orb glowed brighter, and a figure slowly emerged from the shadow stall and radiant, their form adorned with symbols of time and space. You are strong, Kale. But strength alone will not be enough. You will need allies, those who can help you understand the true nature of the storm. Suddenly, the air around Kale seemed to ripple, and in the distance, he saw figures emerge from the shadows, figures he recognized. Elra, the Guardians, even those he had once fought alongside, each one was standing with him, ready to face the coming storm. You are not alone, the figure of time said. But even with your allies, the path will not be easy. The storm will test you, in ways you cannot imagine. Kale nodded, his resolve hardening. I'm ready. As Kale and his allies prepared for the storm to come, strange occurrences began to ripple through the land. The skies turned dark, and the winds howled with an unnatural fury. The very fabric of reality seemed to be trembling, as though the world was on the brink of something catastrophic. Kale stood at the edge of the kingdom, his sword drawn and his heart set on the battle ahead. The Guardians were with him, their forms glowing with the light of the heavens. But as they looked out toward the horizon, they saw an enormous, swirling mass of energy, dark and swirling, descending upon them. This is it, Elra whispered. The storm. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the storm grew nearer, its destructive force threatening to tear everything apart. But Kale stood tall, his eyes locked on the approaching chaos. I will not let this world fall, Kale said, his voice filled with unwavering determination. And so, the hero stood at the edge of the storm, ready to face the ultimate test. The battle would be the fiercest he had ever fought, but in his heart, he knew that light and dark, time and space, would not define him. He would define himself. Kale's journey was far from over, and though the storm raged around him, he knew that he had become something greater. A protector, not just of light, but of the balance itself. The forces of time and space may have tested him, but Kale had learned that true strength came not just from the sword, but from the will to stand tall, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The storm was but the beginning of a new era, one where the hero's awakening would be the spark that ignited the dawn of a new world. The storm roared like a wild beast as Kale and his allies stood at the front lines. The winds howled, the earth trembled, and the sky crackled with flashes of otherworldly energy. The once peaceful land was now a battlefield, and at its heart, Kale could feel a force far beyond his understanding. It wasn't just darkness, it was a primal force, an energy older than time itself. Elra stood beside him, her expression filled with determination, yet tinged with fear. This is no mere storm, Kale. The storm is alive, it has a purpose. We need to find its source before it's too late. Kale nodded. We will find it, together. But even as they spoke, the winds began to change. From the heart of the storm, a massive shadow emerged, a figure, cloaked in swirling clouds of energy. Its form was neither human nor beast, but something ancient and unknowable. Its presence sent a wave of dread through the air, and Kale's sword seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. A response to the presence of this unknown entity. We meet at last, Kale, the figure's voice boomed, deep and resonant, shaking the very air around them. It was the voice of the storm itself, its whispers and roars made flesh. Kale raised his sword, but the figure's words stopped him in his tracks. You have done well to come this far, the figure continued. But you must understand, Kale, that you are nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. The forces of light and darkness are merely fragments. What you see now is the birth of something far more powerful. The figure stepped forward, and the storm seemed to follow its every movement, swirling violently around it. I am the weaving, the force that governs the threads of fate. Time itself bends to my will, and all things are connected in a great cosmic web. The storm is only the beginning of the unraveling. Elra stepped forward, her voice unwavering despite the growing fear. We will not let you unravel the world. The weaving laughed, a sound like thunder crashing. You think your resistance matters? You are ants before a flood. The balance you speak of is fragile. Soon, nothing will remain of your world but ashes. Kale felt the weight of the weaving's words settle heavily in his chest. His mind raced, searching for a way to defeat this entity, but the more he thought, the more he realized the truth of the weaving's words. He was not the one controlling this world. He was a part of a much larger, more intricate design. The weaving's form began to shift, merging with the storm itself. Do you understand now, Kale? It asked, its voice now both distant and intimate. The world is not yours to save. It is mine to shape. But Kale's resolve did not falter. I may not control the world, but I control my fate. And I will not allow you to destroy what I love. With a shout, Kale lunged forward, his sword glowing with the power of the light. The battle for the fate of the world was now in full force. The battle raged on, Kale's sword clashing with the storm's chaotic energy. Every swing seemed to shatter reality itself, sending ripples through time and space. The weaving, an entity of pure cosmic energy, was a formidable opponent. It wielded the very fabric of existence as a weapon, manipulating time, matter, and destiny with a mere thought. As the storm continued to swirl around them, Kale found himself slipping in and out of moments, like threads of a tapestry being pulled in multiple directions. One moment, he was standing beside Elra, the next, he was in the middle of a forest, facing a battle from his past. His mind struggled to keep up with the shifting realities, but Kale clung to his purpose. I will not let you win, Kale gritted through his teeth, striking with his sword. The weaving's laughter echoed through the storm. You misunderstand, Kale. This is not a battle of strength. It is a battle of time. I control the threads, and you are but a moment. But Kale, despite the odds, had an understanding that the weaving could not comprehend. He did not need to control time, he needed to embrace it. Every thread, every twist, every turn of fate had brought him here. His strength lay not in his sword, but in his connection to the very fabric of life, the choices he made, and the bonds he had forged. As Kale stood his ground, he reached deep into the core of his being. Summoning the power of his allies, of his friends, of all the light he had ever fought for. The storm trembled, and Kale's sword flared brighter than ever before, its blade now a beacon of hope. The weaving's form shifted, as if sensing something it could not control. What is this? It demanded. This, Kale said, his voice steady, is the power of will. The will to fight, to protect, to choose our own fate. You may control time, but you cannot control the heart. With a final cry, Kale thrust his sword into the heart of the storm. Light exploded outward in a blinding flash, tearing through the cosmic web the weaving had woven. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop, everything held in perfect balance. And then, with a deafening roar, the storm shattered, the weaving's form dissolving into the air, leaving only a faint echo behind. When the storm cleared, the sky was no longer dark. The sun broke through the clouds, its rays casting warmth across the land. The air was still, but the weight of the battle hung heavy in the hearts of Kale and his allies. Elra stood beside Kale, her gaze soft with relief. "You did it, Kale. You saved us all." But Kale's eyes were distant, filled with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. "The world is safe, for now. But at what cost?" As the dust settled, Kale realized that the weaving's defeat had not come without sacrifice. Time itself had been torn asunder, and the fabric of reality had been stretched thin. The balance was fragile, and the forces that had once seemed distant now felt closer than ever before. The world had been saved, but Kale knew that his journey was far from over. There would always be another storm, another challenge, another force seeking to disrupt the peace. But with the strength of his allies, the power of his heart, and the will to fight, Kale was ready. The hero who awoke the dawn had risen once more, and the future was his to shape. Years passed, and Kale's name became legend. The world had healed, and the scars of the storm faded into history. The balance was restored, but Kale knew that his fight would never truly end. For as long as there were forces of darkness and light, he would stand at the ready, guarding the world he had fought so hard to protect. And though the storm had passed, the dawn of a new era had begun. The sun had risen over the world, but its light did not banish the shadows completely. Peace had been restored, but Kale knew that peace was often only temporary. Time had a way of creating new challenges, even in the quietest moments. Though the weaving had been defeated, Kale could feel that something else was stirring beneath the surface, something he could not yet see, but knew was coming. Elra was by his side once again, her presence a constant source of strength. She had become a trusted ally and a powerful force in her own right. They had rebuilt the lands together, helped the people heal, and restored the harmony that had been shattered. But there were whispers that had been carried by the wind. A new threat was rising, something that the forces of light and darkness could not yet understand. It was neither a storm nor a war, it was something far more insidious. "Do you hear it?" Kale asked one evening, gazing into the horizon. "A strange pull in the air. A sense that something is watching." Elra nodded, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "I feel it too. It's like the very fabric of reality is shifting again. Something ancient is stirring in the shadows." Kale clenched his fists, the weight of his responsibility heavier than ever. The world was at the brink before, but now I fear it's being manipulated by forces we can't even comprehend. As the days passed, the strange pull grew stronger, its influence seeping into the hearts of men, women, and children alike. Kale could see it in their eyes, the fear, the uncertainty. The world had been saved from the storm, but it seemed as though something else was lurking beneath the surface. One night, as Kale walked alone through the quiet forest, he came upon an ancient monument ruins that had once been a great temple to a long-forgotten deity. The air around the ruins was thick, heavy with an energy Kale could not place. It was the same energy he had felt during his battle with the weaving, but more subtle, more insidious. He stepped closer to the ruins, his senses alert. And then, as if summoned by his presence, the earth trembled. The air crackled with a strange energy, and a figure emerged from the darkness, familiar, yet different. "Kale," the figure said softly, its voice echoing in the stillness of the night. Kale's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice, but it should not have been possible. It was a voice from his past, a voice he thought was lost to the shadows. "Master," Kale whispered, his throat tight. "No, it can't be." The figure before him was none other than his long-lost mentor. The one who had taught him the ways of combat, the art of magic, and the responsibility that came with wielding great power. But something was wrong. His mentor's once warm gaze was now cold, and the shadows around him seemed to twist and writhe with every movement. "I've watched you, Kale," the figure said. "I've seen the hero you've become. But you've forgotten something. You've forgotten the true purpose of your existence. Kale took a step back. What are you talking about? The figure's eyes glowed with an eerie light. The storm, the weaving it was only a part of the plan. You were never meant to defeat them, Kale. You were meant to awaken them. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kale's mind raced, trying to comprehend the meaning behind them. No, I don't understand. I fought to protect this world. I fought to save it. The figure laughed darkly, the sound like the crackle of thunder in the distance. You were a tool, Kale. A puppet. You think you fought to save the world, but the truth is, you were meant to bring it to its knees. You were meant to awaken the forces that slumber beneath it. Suddenly, the ground beneath Kale's feet cracked open, and a dark energy began to pour from the depths of the earth. The ruins seemed to pulse with life, and Kale realized with horror that the monument was not just a ruin, it was a seal. A seal that had kept something imprisoned for millennia. His mentor stepped forward, his hands raised. It's too late, Kale. The cycle has begun again. You cannot stop what you've set in motion. The dark energy swirled around Kale, pulling him toward the heart of the ruins. He struggled to break free, but the force was too strong. His sword, once a beacon of light, now felt like a mere weight in his hands. The power that had once been his ally was now flickering, fading in the face of this new force. Master, Kale said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. What have you done? I've done nothing, Kale, the figure replied, his voice echoing with malevolent joy. I've merely opened your eyes. You were always part of the plan, part of a much greater design. Kale's mind raced, trying to understand the true nature of the battle he had fought. Had everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed, been in vain? Had his victory been nothing more than a trigger for something far darker? From the depths of the earth, a shape began to rise, a massive, shadowy figure, its form twisting and shifting like liquid darkness. It was a creature of nightmares, its eyes glowing with a deep, unholy light. It was ancient, older than time itself, and as it emerged from the ground, the world seemed to tremble in fear. This is the true enemy, Kale's former mentor said, his eyes filled with reverence. The force that has been lying in wait beneath your world. The one who will shape the future, not through storms or battles, but through the very essence of existence. Kale's heart pounded in his chest as he faced the darkness that had been unleashed. He had fought to protect the world, but now he realized that the world was not the only thing at risk. Time, reality, and the very fabric of existence itself were now in jeopardy. The battle had only just begun. The creature that had emerged from the depths of the earth towered above Kale, its form a shifting mass of dark tendrils and shadowed voids. Its eyes glowing with an otherworldly energy locked onto Kale with an intense, predatory focus. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Kale's sword, once a shining symbol of hope, now felt heavy and dull in his hands. The dark energy that surrounded him seemed to smother the very essence of his power. His once unshakable resolve faltered as the gravity of the situation sank in. This was not just a battle for the world, it was a battle for the very fabric of existence itself. The figure before him, his former mentor, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. You cannot fight this, Kale. It is already too late. Kale's heart raced as he took a step back. I refuse to believe that, he said, his voice shaking with a mix of defiance and fear. I've fought too hard, lost too much, to let it all end like this. The dark creature's laughter echoed through the ruins, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to reverberate in Kale's bones. You were never meant to fight me, Kale. You were meant to serve. You and the others like you, mere pawns in a game far older than you could ever understand. With a sudden surge of movement, the creature raised one of its shadowy arms, sending a wave of dark energy crashing toward Kale. He barely had time to react, his sword flicking up in an attempt to block the blow. The impact sent him hurtling backward, slamming into the side of the ruined monument. The world around him spun. His vision blurred, and the sound of his pulse thrummed in his ears. Pain shot through him as he struggled to stand, his body aching from the force of the attack. But even as the darkness threatened to consume him, Kale's resolve burned brighter. He had come too far to let it end like this. The figure of his mentor stood nearby, watching with a detached amusement as Kale struggled. "You think you can stop it? You think you can stop him?" he asked, his voice laced with pity. "You were never more than a tool, Kale. And now, that tool is broken." Kale's vision sharpened, and his grip on his sword tightened. "I don't care what you say," he growled, rising to his feet. "I will never be your pawn. I will never serve darkness. Not now, not ever." The dark creature turned its gaze toward him, its eyes narrowing as it sensed Kale's growing defiance. For a moment, the creature seemed to hesitate, as if uncertain of how to deal with this unexpected resistance. In that moment, Kale felt the stirrings of something ancient and powerful deep within him. His training, his battles, his very soul, all of it had prepared him for this. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a protector, a defender of the light. And the light, no matter how dim, could never be snuffed out as long as he stood. With a cry, Kale thrust his sword forward, channeling every ounce of his strength into the blade. The sword pulsed with light, a brilliant flare that cut through the dark energy like a knife through cloth. He could feel the power of his ancestors flowing through him, guiding his strike as the sword met the creature's shadowy form. For a moment, the world held its breath. The creature recoiled, a shrill scream tearing from its twisted form as the light of Kale's blade pushed back the darkness. But the moment was fleeting. The dark energy roared back, its influence pressing in on Kale like a crushing weight. "You think you've won?" the figure of Kale's mentor sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. This is the end, Kale. The end of all things." Kale's body trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with an unrelenting fire. "I will not let this be the end." In the distance, a sudden gust of wind blew through the ruins, carrying with it a faint, familiar melody. Elra's voice, like a song of hope, echoed across the battlefield, reaching Kale's ears. "You are not alone, Kale. We are with you." His heart surged with renewed strength. Elra and the others were coming. They were not just fighting for the world, they were fighting for each other. Together, they could face the darkness. With a final, determined cry, Kale pushed forward, his sword blazing with light. The dark creature's form writhed and recoiled, but it could not withstand the pure force of Kale's will. The clash between light and shadow continued, a battle not only for the future of the world, but for the soul of the hero who would decide its fate. The battle waged on for what seemed like an eternity, with Kale and the dark force locked in a deadly struggle. But as the light of Kale's blade pierced the heart of the shadow, something unexpected happened. The darkness recoiled, then faltered, its form dissolving into the ether. The air grew still, the oppressive weight of the battle lifting, and Kale fell to his knees, exhausted. His sword fell from his grasp, and his breath came in ragged gasps. His body was broken, but his spirit had not been defeated. Around him, the world began to change. The ruins, once a symbol of the past's horrors, now seemed to pulse with the quiet hum of life. The energy of the earth itself seemed to shift, as though the very ground beneath Kale's feet was breathing once again. From the darkness, Elra appeared, her face radiant with a quiet, unspoken triumph. "It's over, Kale," she said softly, her voice filled with relief. "You did it." Kale's gaze turned upward, toward the horizon. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the sky, painting the world in golden light. The long, endless night had ended, and with it, a new day had begun. The battle was over, but the journey, Kale knew, was only just beginning. The first light of dawn washed over the land, casting long shadows as the world slowly began to heal. The ruins, once a place of darkness and despair, were now touched by the soft glow of the rising sun. The air was filled with the scent of renewal, of life returning where once there had only been decay. Kale stood alone at the center of the battlefield, his body bruised and broken, but his spirit unyielding. He had faced the greatest darkness, and yet, the dawn had come. But the journey was far from over. The battle may have been won, but a new world needed to be forged, one that would be free from the chains of the past and the shadow of the ancient forces. As Elra approached him, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding, Kale turned his gaze toward the horizon. "It's hard to believe it's over," he said, his voice hoarse from the battle. "After everything, it still feels like there's so much left to do." Elra placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "You don't have to do it alone, Kale. We're all here to rebuild, to guide this new era together. You've given everything to protect the world. Now, it's time for the world to heal." Her words were a balm to his weary soul. Kale nodded, a quiet gratitude in his heart. He had not been alone in this fight. His allies, his friends, his people had all been by his side, and together, they had achieved the impossible. The winds whispered through the trees, and Kale closed his eyes, feeling the energy of the world flow around him. The darkness had been pushed back, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. And yet, there was hope. There was always hope, as long as there were people willing to fight for it. The people of the world began to gather, their faces reflecting the hope that Kale had restored. They had lived in fear for so long, haunted by the ancient forces that had once sought to claim their world. But now, as the dust settled, they could see a future beyond the shadows, a future shaped by their own hands. In the days that followed the battle, Kale and Elra gathered the leaders of the world, mages, warriors, healers, and scholars to form a new council. This council would be charged with ensuring that the mistakes of the past were never repeated, and that the forces of darkness would never again rise to threaten the world. Sitting at the head of the table, Kale surveyed the faces of those who had once been his enemies but were now allies in the fight for a better future. There was still tension in the air, but it was a tension born of uncertainty, not hostility. "We are standing at the threshold of something new," Kale said, his voice steady and calm. "The world has been fractured for so long. It's time to build something strong enough to withstand the storms that may come." A mage, one of the ancient scholars who had once served the dark forces, spoke up. "The forces we faced were only part of a much larger design. There are secrets in this world, secrets that have been hidden for centuries. We must learn from the past, but we must also be cautious. Not all knowledge is meant to be uncovered." Kale nodded. "We must tread carefully, but we can no longer allow fear to dictate our actions. We will learn, but we will never again let our thirst for power overshadow the well-being of the world." Elra stood beside him, her presence a steady reminder of the light that could always overcome darkness. "We will be the guardians of this new world. Together." The council agreed, and so, the foundations of a new era were laid. No longer would the world be ruled by the whims of dark forces or ancient prophecies. The people would take their destiny into their own hands, guided by the wisdom of the past but driven by the hope for a brighter future. In the months that followed, Kale began his work as a leader, not a warrior. He spent his days traveling from village to village, town to town, listening to the needs of the people and helping to rebuild what had been lost. Though he still trained and fought when necessary, he found that the true strength of a hero lay not in the sword, but in the heart. As he walked through a quiet village one evening, Kale found himself stopped by a group of children. They were laughing and playing, their faces bright with innocence and joy, something Kale had not seen in many years. One of the children, a young girl with bright eyes, tugged at his sleeve. "Are you the hero?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Kale smiled, crouching down to her level. "I was once, but heroes are made in many ways. A hero can be someone who protects others, but it can also be someone who helps their neighbor or stands up for what's right." The girl's eyes sparkled. "I want to be a hero like you." Kale's heart swelled with pride. "You can be," he said. "You just have to choose to be brave, no matter how small the step may seem." As the children ran off to continue their play, Kale stood for a moment, watching them. He realized then that his true legacy was not just the battles he had fought, but the lives he had touched. The future he had helped to shape was not one of endless conflict, but one where hope and courage could grow. In the quiet of the evening, as the stars began to twinkle overhead, Kale felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. The endless night was behind him, and the hero's journey, his journey, was just beginning. Kale stood atop a hill, looking out over the land. The world was slowly returning to normal, but Kale knew that the true battle had always been within. The struggle to protect not just the world, but the people within it. The battle to preserve hope and light against the darkness that always threatened to return. But now, there was peace. And Kale had learned that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of unity. It was the willingness to face whatever came, not alone, but together. He turned to Elra, who stood beside him, her gaze focused on the horizon. "We've done it, haven't we?" Kale said softly. Elra smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Yes. But the journey isn't over. The world is always changing, always in need of guardians. And you, Kale, are one of those guardians." Kale nodded, his heart full of determination. The world was reborn, and with it, the promise of a future where light would always overcome the darkness. Together, they walked into the future one step at a time, knowing that as long as they stood side by side, they would be ready for whatever came next. Today's story ends here. See you later.